bringing love and care to unwanted children or riddled with pitfalls and corruption. What's the truth about international adoption, and should the world be doing more to guard the innocent? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. It's huge global business, but it's open to abuse. The lives of hundreds of thousands of children depend on it. So is enough being done to regulate international adoption? Well, this week, Guatemalan police have rescued nearly 50 infants from what they claim was an illegal adoption home. Some of them as young as 3 days old. Well, it's feared the children had been stolen or that their parents had been coerced into handing them over. The couple who run the home say it's legitimate. Well, more than 4,000 couples from the US alone adopt from Guatemala each year in a business worth some $200 million annually. Child theft is common in this poor Central American state, and welfare organizations say adoption laws are lax. Well, the baby trade appears to be on the rise, and it's happening all over the world. The greatest number of babies being adopted come from China, followed by Guatemala and Russia. There were at least 100,000 legal adoptions abroad between 1989 and 2003 from Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asian states. Spurred on by poverty and corruption, the baby trade is a lucrative business. UNICEF estimates the global trade is worth many millions of dollars annually. Prospective parents can pay anywhere between $20,000 to $40,000 per child. Figures on the baby trade are hard to come by. It's often difficult to distinguish between trafficking and legitimate adoption. But one figure that is clear, an estimated 2/3 of children put up for adoption are girls. Well, we're now joined by our guests in London, LOUISE Melville, a care advisor for the charity Save the Children, and in Chicago, Tom DeFilippo, Chief Executive of the Joint Council on International Children's Services. Thanks for being with us. If I could start with Tom. International adoptions have soared, haven't they, in the last 30 years? Why? And is that a good thing?
I think overall it's a good thing. Certainly in the past 20 years or so, approximately 500,000 children have found permanent loving homes and safe homes through intercountry adoption. There has been quite a spike in the past 15 to 20 years, and I think that was had large in fact to do with the fall of the Soviet Union and also the opening of intercountry adoption with China. So I don't know that there's a negative necessarily to the big increase that you're talking about. And specifically the last 2 years, it's actually decreased 2 years in a row, and we expect another decrease again this year.
All right, let's see if LOUISE in London agrees with that. Is there simply, would you agree with those who say there's simply too much money, too much corruption in the international adoption system?
Yeah, one of the main concerns of Save the Children is intercountry adoption can be big business with, on average, a child costing £20,000. And there are lots of examples of parents being coerced to give up their children, children being abducted, adoption papers being forged. And we would always encourage national solutions instead of inter-country adoption. So, for example, looking for children to remain with their families when they have parents, or for fostering or national adoption, with international adoption as a last resort.
So from your perspective then, inter-country adoptions really need to be a sort of last resort?
Yeah, we know that the majority of children, for example, in orphanages worldwide are not actually orphans. They have one or both parents alive. And tragically, often those parents are forced to give up their children because of poverty, or in the worst cases, they may have been coerced to give up their children. And we also know that it's not only is it far better for children, but it's many times cheaper to support children in their own families and communities. When children don't have parents to care for them, then national adoption would be the first option. And when national adoption has been explored and is not an alternative, only then should international adoption be considered, in Save the Children's opinion.
All right, Tom in Chicago, you agree with that basically it should be, international adoption should be a last resort?
I think the only option after intercountry adoption would be institutionalization, and I believe that LOUISE and Save the Children would probably agree with that institutionalization is the absolute last. But in the full spectrum of children's services, yes, intercountry adoption should be one of the last resorts. And the only part I would disagree with what Louise just mentioned is that we would encourage for preventive measures to be taken with families. Sometimes it just takes as little as $20 a month or $50 a month to enable a family to keep their child rather than to abandon them or relinquish them for adoption, whether that's domestic or international. And certainly foster care plays a big role in providing the full spectrum of services to children. But that prevention piece, I believe, is something that the international development community really needs to take a look at.
We'll talk more in the second half of the show about the role the international community perhaps should be playing in all of this. But Luis, Romania is one of the countries that recently passed laws, or I shouldn't say recently, a number of years ago passed laws banning international adoption. Do you think that's a right step to take?
A lot of attention was put on Romania and the state of its institutions as well, and unfortunately institutions or orphanages are often the broker for international adoption, and conditions within orphanages are often extremely poor, with children very vulnerable to abuse or neglect. And in light of concerns that checks aren't being taken place, so for example there may not be social workers who can check that a child is eligible to be adopted, or that prospective adopted parents are prospectively, good families for children to go into. That such countries are, who are taking these concerns seriously, are closing the doors to international adoption. And it's not just Romania; China also is tightening up its regulations.
So you're saying, in other words, sorry to interrupt, but you're saying in other words that these sort of bans on international adoption can be helpful, can help countries to focus on their internal situation?
One of the concerns for Save the Children is where there are orphanages, it can often encourage children to abandon, encourage families to abandon their children, and the focus really should be on support services, and those services should prevent families from being forced to give up their children. Unfortunately, where there is a lot of inter-country adoption, it may be a get-out for governments to invest in those kind of family support services.
All right, Tom, do bans and restrictions help countries to clean up their internal acts, or they simply push buyers to other markets?
No, I think they just shift the market. The largest countries, or the countries that are doing the most in inter-country adoption, China, Russia. Let's leave Guatemala to the side for 1 second. In China and in Russia, I don't think you see the abuses or the corruption that Louise speaks of. I think that China is shifting their focus to domestic adoption and foster care, which we applaud. But to just say that bans on inter-country adoption somehow stops families from abandoning their children, if that was the case, then in countries such as Romania, you wouldn't see the hospitals filling up with children who have been abandoned or relinquished. You wouldn't see street children around. So to say that inter-country adoption should be simply banned and then there's a fix, I think is short-sighted and unrealistic, and it doesn't deal with the realities of our world.
All right, strong words there. Louise, your response to that?
I mean, Save the Children is not calling for a ban on international adoption. For those children where there's no national adoption options in countries, then international adoption is a viable solution. What we are asking for is that there are services in place to prevent children from being adopted unnecessarily, and when international adoption is an option, that it's done safely and in the best interests of children.
Right, well, let's take a little look at the track record on bans. Some would argue they show that unilateral, bilateral measures don't work, and really an international approach is needed. Do you agree with that? That's for Louise, sorry.
What Save the Children is calling for is investment in family support services. So that's things like access to education, health, daycare, financial support services, so families aren't forced to abandon children. And international organisations like Save the Children are working in many countries in the world to do exactly that.
Despite all the aid that might be offered to families, at the end of the day, if there are people who are determined to practice child trafficking, some sort of international coordination is necessary to counter that?
Well, there is international legislation, the Hague Convention. The problem is there's only approximately 70 countries who've signed up, and even then many of these countries haven't implemented the legislation. So any country engaging in international adoption should have signed the Hague Convention which you know, is there to make sure that international adoption is safe. You know, in conjunction with that, the receiving countries also need to do checks. So, for example, the UK and the US do DNA checks to make sure that the parents who are giving up the children are genuinely the parents. However, even in those situations, there's no guarantee that those parents haven't been forced or coerced into giving up their children.
All right, let's go to Tom. There, Louise, mentioning the Hague Convention. Some would say it's still too loose. Does it need tightening?
Certainly it needs tightening. The Hague Convention is a broad framework under which countries can implement proper protocols for inter-country adoption. However, as Louise mentioned, some countries are not implementing it. For instance, Guatemala, we've been advocating for months and years, actually, down in Guatemala for proper reform. They are a Hague country, but they do not have a Hague compliant system in place yet. And this is where I mentioned earlier, I think the international community needs to assist countries such as Guatemala or others that are Hague signatures but not compliant to come up to speed and get their laws and the regulations such that we don't have these concerns about inter-country adoption. Many, many inter-country adoptions are done legally, properly, and with the right protocols. But unfortunately, there's many children that also find themselves victims of improper trafficking, if you would call it that. I do have a problem calling it trafficking simply because the children are not, at the end of the day, they're in a permanent home. They're not used for the sex trade or slave labor. There's plenty of that goes on that is legitimate trafficking or can be called legitimately trafficking. So I do have a problem with that terminology.
Right, that's a really sensitive and controversial issue, and the issue of definitions we'll get into later on. It is now time for a short break. When we come back, rules are fine on paper, but are they enforceable if you want to adopt a baby? And the orphanage asks you for medical and humanitarian supplies. Is that payment? Is it a bribe? Or is it compassion? We'll look for the answers when we return. Stay with us.